So tonight we commemorate the birthday of Fatima alayhi salam. And there's so many different qualities that we could talk about with her life. And so I just decided to select one of them. And just to choose the topic of simplicity. So in many ways, Fatima alayhi salam embodied this quality throughout her life, the way that she carried herself throughout. And it's something that we can all learn from in our own lives. So I just kind of want to go through first what simplicity is, some pitfalls from the simplicity, and then how Fatima alayhi salam in Islam embodies this idea of simplicity. So when we're defining simplicity, there's so many different directions that you could go, but I always like to think of it as less is more. And so it's really clarifying what your focus is and keeping your eyes on the right thing. So often in life we have so many things going on, we have a massive schedule, and we're not even sure what our priorities are. And so simplicity is maintaining focus on those right things. So who knows what these are? Jaffa. Legos. So when you think of Legos, what do you think about? Yeah. Yeah, so you think of building Legos, right? So for the longest time, this is all that the Legos used to do. But then all of a sudden, they started to branch out into other areas. So they started to have a clothing line. They created Lego lands. They had Lego watches. And then you have Lego TV shows. So you have all of these different areas that they started to branch into. And so what this really created was something called the clarity paradox. It's embodied this idea. So you have phase one of the clarity paradox is when you become successful in what you're doing. You have a clarity of purpose, you get very good at it, and then you become successful. And then once you get that success, then you get money, then you get position, and then it leads to more opportunities. And when you get these more opportunities, it leads to more ways to diffuse your effort. So not only is you can do more than Legos, we can do this too. And the idea is that it's only going to add to what you're doing. You're not going to be subtracting to anything that you already did. But the reality is that once you start diffusing those efforts throughout, you start to lose focus on what made you successful in the first place. So the Lego company hired this new CEO, and his job in 2004 was to help clarify what the vision is for this company. And so he went through the entire portfolio of the company and says, what's the essential things that we're doing, and what are the things that are not essential? And so for those things that were not essential, he decided to sell them all off and focus on the idea of what Legos really are. They're the building blocks for kids. They're fostering creativity. And so since he made these changes, the stock of Lego throughout the last 10 years has increased dramatically. You see, it's almost quadrupled in value over the last 10 years. And what about this company here, Ford? What is Ford known for?
Cars.
Cars, yeah. Are they good cars or bad cars? They're good? Well, about 10 years ago, pretty much nobody thought they were good cars. Maybe still today. And so this guy came along not too long before the recession in 2006, I believe. And he was hired to try to fix Ford Company. So this guy, Alan Mulally, he took over at a time when the fuel prices were high. Nobody wanted the SUVs anymore. Nobody wanted the Fords. So the market share was going, everyone Toyotas, Hondas. The sales were a problem, the healthcare costs were increasing. And the company was supposed to lose about $13 billion that calendar year. That's not the situation that most people want to come into. But similar to the way the Lego CEO handled things, he decided to focus on the clarity of the vision for what the company was about. And so you see, Ford at the time had 8 major brands. So the 2 major brands that he identified were Ford and Lincoln. The other ones, Mercury, Mazda, Volvo, Jaguar, Land Rover. All of these, he decided we're not gonna focus on these anymore. We're gonna sell these off. I mean, we're selling off Jaguar. These are one of the signature brands for the company. Instead of going from 125,000 employees, reduced to 70,000. 40% reduction. In the different products, the different models, decreased from 222 to 102. So what he says is, what are the things that are making us successful? What are these other things that are getting in the way? And so let's focus on just those 2 brands, and let's build around that. Let's make parts that are interchangeable between all of these. And similarly to the last story with the Lego CEO, when he took over, there was a sharp decline. And this trough right here corresponds to the recession from 2008 to 2009. Interestingly, though, of the 3 major Detroit motor companies, Ford was the only one to not take the TARP loan. And since that point, there has been a large increase in Ford's brand. And the credibility of I think subjectively, the credibility of the company today is much better than it was about 10 or 15 years ago. So a focused company has a strategy that whenever they add new businesses or they enter new markets, they're reinforcing what their core values are. And it should be such that anybody from the janitor to the CEO can say the same thing, and they know exactly what this company is about. But this idea highlights the clarity paradox that we talked about before. If you're not focused on your core, on what makes you successful, and you get away from that, then that's when you can start getting into problems. So this guy here, this is the next pitfall. And this is a French philosopher and writer by the name of Denis Diderot. And this guy lived a very simple life. So his main objective in life was creating encyclopedias, and he was a writer. So he was researching, and this occupied the majority of his day. But when his daughter got married, and he needed to get a dowry, back in the days when Europeans used dowries, he didn't have the money to provide this. So he decided to sell off his prized encyclopedia collection to Catherine the Great at the time. And that gave him about $50,000 modern US dollars equivalent to what he had. And this is way more money than he's ever had in his life. And not only did he have enough money for the dowry, but then he had enough money for this nice scarlet robe that he bought. And then he observed that there was no more coordination and no more unity, no more beauty between his robe and the rest of his items. So he lived in a very simple house, but then he has this very elegant robe. So then he decides that this simple chair that he used to have, he should probably upgrade it to make it look nicer with the rest of his outfit. And then that rug, we should probably get a new one. And then that old table that we used to write the encyclopedias on, let's get the brand new one. And so this was later called the Diderot effect, where it says obtaining a new possession often creates a spiral of consumption, which leads you to acquire even more new things. I want you to think about this in your own life. When have you bought something new and then you decide that you need 12 other things to go with it? Who's recently here moved into a new house?
This never happens, but I heard something.
So what about that new dress that you buy? Don't you also want the matching earrings and the shoes to go with it? Or that new gym membership, you want to get all the nice gear, the foam roller, the wrist wrap, the meal plans to go along with it, And then what about the new car? You got to get the maintenance, the new car charger, the cell phone holder, seat covers, umbrella, the fire hydrant. You got to get the whole thing. And so this idea is that once you start letting one thing in, it starts letting more things in. And so how do we stop this? And before I go on, some of these things here, we're not saying they're not necessary or useful, but it's just something to be aware of. So the first way to prevent this is to reduce your exposure. I don't know how many of you have the email subscriptions. Every day they send you new products, everything. How many people shop at the mall when you have 100 different stores around you? Or this one's my weakness, Slick Deals, the website. Everything's on sale every day. So the more you're exposing yourself to these temptations, the more you're going to let yourself fall for these consumerist tendencies. The other idea is to buy items that fit into your current system. So that robe that Diderot bought did not fit into his current system, and so then he had to create a new system around that. Why not identify what is our core needs? What are we aiming for? And then build around that. The other part is imposing some self-imposed limits on yourself. Understanding your own budgets, not exceeding those things. Understanding that you don't always need those new things. Another strategy is buy one, give one. If you buy a new TV, give away your old TV. You buy a new outfit, give away one of your old outfits. That way you're still circulating out things so that you're not just accumulating more resources. And then maybe a challenge, similar, just like the way that we fast for a month. Why not go a month without buying something new? And see how it feels. See how if your resourcefulness will increase. That you didn't really realize that you didn't always need that new thing. That you can get by without it. And then the other thing about just letting go of wanting new things. So there's like the analogy of a little kid who's shopping in the toy store, and there's a new car that the little kid wants. And so the little kid asks the parents if they can have that car. And then the parents say no, but then the child's like, but this is all I want. Once I get this, then I'll be so happy, I won't bother you anymore with anything. Well, you know that's never going to happen. And then once that kid grows up, then he gets his first car. It's a beat-up Honda, but that's the best car that person has. Then when they get a better job, they want the BMW. And then maybe when they really make it, they want the Ferrari. But even then, when does it stop? There's always an upgrade. There's always a 2.0. There's always the next iPhone to get. You'll never get caught up. The other thing is this idea about the fear of missing out, FOMO. This is usually with the young people. They always want to get involved in every activity. That new thing is going to be the best thing. And so we have to let go of this idea that next thing is going to fulfill my life. And the last pitfall is this concept called the endowment effect. And so, in a traditional economic model, you'd expect that if people have equal resources of equal value, that they would be traded about 50% of the time. So in this study, let's say 50 people, 25 of the people got a mug, and the other 25 got a pen. And these had equivalent value. So they say, how many people would trade? Because they said, go ahead and trade if you like to get an upgrade. And they found that instead of it being 25 mugs getting traded for 25 pens, there was a much larger proportion of people wanting to hold on to the item that they had. And so the endowment effect is the tendency to value an item that we own more than we would just if it was any other item. So how many of you have that car that you really love and that you would never get rid of it, and you ask somebody how much you would pay, you would sell it for, and you'd say $1,000 over the Kelly Blue Book, because this car is my car, I take good care of it, it's, everything about it is perfect. Sometimes we have a problem letting go of our own possessions. So how do we fix this? So instead of asking the question, how much do I value this item, my personal value, you can ask the question, how much would it cost for me to just obtain this item if I did not own it? Let's look at it if it was any item on the shelf. So depersonalizing that can lead to prevent that. But this endowment effect can be dangerous because it can lead to accumulation of a lot of resources. And it's something that we need to be aware of. So I want to kind of come back to the life of Fatima alayhi salam. So she's a woman who lived a very simple life. In the very few possessions that she owned, she would treat them as if they belonged to the person who asked without any hesitation. She spent most of her days grinding up barley and wheat by hand. And she was a lady of very few possessions. So there's a story about her on her wedding night. Imagine what most people are on their wedding nights. Planning all the little details in their head. They're very nervous. Making sure their hair looks great. They have a great wedding dress. So on the night of Fatima alayhi salam's wedding, she was greeted by a beggar who came to her door and asked if she had any old clothing that she would be willing to spare her. And she thought, well, I have two things. I have this dress, wedding dress that my father gave me for tomorrow, and I have my other dress, which is just an old rag. I could give this away, but she considered otherwise. She was remembering a verse in the Quran that says, "Never will you attain the good reward until you spend in the way of Allah from that which you love." So ultimately, Fatima alayhi salam gave up her wedding dress the night before her wedding, and she ended up wearing the old dress. This is somebody who never had any endowment effect. The night before her wedding, she gave away her wedding dress. And she has complete clarity of vision as to what she wants in life. She understands that on the night before the wedding, when everybody is focused on everything else besides the Quran or religion, she's remembering a verse in the Quran, and she puts that above the idea of having a nice wedding dress, because that wasn't important to her. In her mind, there's one thing that matters. And what about her dowry? Her dowry was about less than 500 dirhams from the shield of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And what about the home that she went to? It had a sheepskin to sleep on, a pillow made of tree fibers, a bed that's made of branches, a quern to mill her barley and wheat, a water skin to drink from, 2 jars, and a pottery vase. That's about as fancy as it gets, a little pottery vase. This is somebody with complete clarity of mind. She knows exactly what's important to her. She doesn't care about these other things. It doesn't add anything to her life. And so when we think about Islam, we think about the straight path. We think of maintaining on that course. And the example of the Ahl Bayt alayhi salam is that they tell us what the straight path is. And the Quran makes it very simple for us what our purpose is. It doesn't lead us to guess. Allah says He created jinn and humankind so that they may worship Him. And how are we supposed to do that? He tells us very clearly. He tells us to make a certain declaration. La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. And he tells us very specific, these are the obligations you have to do, and these are the things to stay away from. Now a lot of people will think that this is not enough. But I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell us what's important for us to do. He said that the Quran is made easy for us. He says He knows us better than we know ourselves. So why not we just focus on the very basics here? Focus on what it means. What does La ilaha illallah mean? Just to consider that very carefully. And make sure we have complete understanding of that. You know, I want you to think about the professional athletes you see, the really good ones. You know, if you talk to Kobe Bryant, all those other people, you watch them practice, they're not practicing the behind the back, fadeaway three-pointers in the gym. They're practicing dribbling. They focus on passing. They're doing the same things that they did since elementary school. They have clarity of mind. They understand the basics. Once you know the basics, you're good at the basics, everything leads from there. And if you ask some of the great scholars what they talk about achieving that great high spiritual status, they say that you can achieve that high spiritual status by solely doing just the basics, the wajibat, the haramat. You don't need to go you don't need to do the 50 extra prayers a day. You don't need to go to Dua Kumail every single Thursday. If you're focusing on this, if your prayer is good, if you're fasting like you should, and these are solid, these are the things that you need to focus on. So just some closing thoughts here. I think it's important for all of us to kind of do a life audit. Okay, if any of you run a business, you make sure that everything in your business, every single expense that comes in, makes sense, that it needs to be there. You know, we need to do the same with our own lives. What are the things that are complicating what we want in our own lives? We shouldn't be afraid to downsize things if we need to. Are we spending enough time with our families? Are they complaining that we don't get to see them at all? Are we working 100 hours a week? Is that in line with what we want? Are we able to make it to the masjid as often as we want? Are we going to the masjid? Whenever you bring in new things into your life, you want a very strict criteria to that. Because you realize that once you bring one thing in, there's a lot of hidden costs to that. As we talked about with the Diderot effect, you never know always what those other things will do, and they won't always bring you happiness. It's always important to find what makes you successful and refine it relentlessly. Don't stray away from that. Find what you're good at and keep getting better at it. Don't move on to the next thing because you think you've mastered it. There's only a few things in life you get a chance to focus on. Make sure that those are the ones. And your time is your most valuable asset. If your calendar is filled with so many things in your schedule that don't mean anything to you, it's maybe a good time to reevaluate those things. And the last thing is that the life of this world is like salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you'll get. You always think that next drink may be the one that helps you satisfied, but it'll always keep going. And so then I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He helps us to understand this idea of simplicity, and that He helps us to achieve it in our own lives. And that we use the example of Fatima alayhi salam to do that. Salat Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.